6:17 in the morning, and the coffee was still dripping when Dean Halford heard the engines. He set the pot down and walked to the window. 10 black SUVs were lined along the gravel drive, bumper to bumper, blocking the only way out. Men in dark suits stepped onto the dirt and positioned themselves around the property. No one spoke. The woman was already standing behind him. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with a blanket over her shoulders and a mug she had not touched. Now she was on her feet, looking past Dean through the glass. Her hand tightened around the ceramic. One man broke from the line and walked toward the porch. Dean stepped between her and the front door. "They're here for me," she said quietly. Dean did not move. This is one of those stories that starts at the end and works its way back to the beginning. Stay for the whole thing. It will be worth it. 14 hours earlier, the afternoon sun sat low over the Wilmington River on the east side of Savannah, Georgia, and Dean Halford was sanding the hull of a 22-foot center console that had been sitting in his shop for 3 weeks. The shop was not much. A corrugated steel building set back from the water on a half-acre lot, with a concrete pad out front and a boat ramp that led down to a floating dock. There was a lathe in the corner, a welding table against the far wall, and a row of clamps hung on pegs above the workbench in descending order of size. Everything had a place. Everything was where it belonged. Dean had opened the shop in the spring of 22, 6 months after he moved to Savannah from Norfolk, Virginia. He had not planned to come here specifically. He had driven south with a 9-year-old boy and a truck full of tools and stopped when the road felt far enough. The boy's name was Ben. He was quiet in the way some children are quiet, not from shyness, but from preference. He came to the shop after school most days, dropped off by the neighbor next door, a retired woman named Fran Colby, who had started watching him without being asked and never stopped. Ben had his own corner of the workbench, a small vise, a set of files, a half-finished model of a shrimp trawler he had been building from balsa wood for 2 months. He did not rush it. Dean's wife, Elise, had died in 21. A highway accident outside Norfolk on a Tuesday morning in October. Dean had been at work. He came home to a police cruiser in the driveway and a chaplain standing on his front porch, and the world he had built over 15 years folded in on itself in the time it took to walk from his truck to the door. He did not talk about it. Not to Fran. Not to clients. Not to Ben. Except in the small ways that mattered. Keeping her picture on the shelf above the lathe. Making her pot roast recipe on Sundays, even though he always overcooked the carrots. Answering honestly when Ben asked a question and leaving it alone when he did not. The shop kept him steady. Fiberglass and epoxy and marine paint. Problems that could be measured, cut, shaped, and solved. He was good at it, better than a man who had only been doing it for 3 years should have been. But no one in Savannah knew why, and he did not volunteer the reason. By 6 that evening, Dean had finished the sanding, sealed the hull with a primer coat, and cleaned his tools. Ben was at the kitchen table doing math homework. Dean made spaghetti. They ate without the television on. Ben washed his plate, said goodnight, and went upstairs. Dean sat on the porch with a glass of water and listened to the river. At 10:45, he locked the front door and turned off the lights. At 11:12, someone knocked. It was not a hard knock. 3 strikes, evenly spaced, like someone who had practiced being calm on the walkover. Dean pulled on his boots and opened the door. A woman stood on the porch. She was alone. No car in the driveway, no headlights on the road. She carried herself like someone accustomed to being in control, but something underneath that composure had shifted. Her posture was straight. Her breathing was measured. But her right hand was gripping the strap of her bag like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She said her car had broken down about a mile up the road. No cell signal. She had walked until she saw a light. Dean looked past her into the dark. The nearest house was Fran's, 200 yards east, and Fran's lights were off. He stepped aside. He gave her a pillow and a blanket and a glass of water. He pointed to the couch. He told her the bathroom was down the hall. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she had been going or where she had come from. She sat on the edge of the couch with the glass in both hands, and Dean went back to his room and closed the door. He did not sleep well, but he did not check on her either. Some people needed space more than they needed questions. Dean woke at 5:40 and started the coffee. She was already up. The blanket was folded into a neat square on the arm of the couch, the pillow centered on top of it. She was standing by the kitchen window with her arms crossed, looking out at the river. When she heard him, she turned and offered a small nod, the kind between strangers who have shared something without naming it. He poured 2 cups. She took hers with both hands. They stood in the kitchen without speaking for a while. The light outside was gray and early. A blue heron was standing in the shallows near the dock, motionless, waiting. She said she would call a tow truck. Dean told her he had a hitch on his truck and could drive her out to look at the car himself. She hesitated, not from mistrust, but from the kind of reluctance that comes when someone is used to handling things alone and is not sure what to do with an offer that has no strings attached. She accepted. They never made it out the door. The engines came first, then the gravel, then the line of black SUVs rolling into the drive like a military detail, 10 vehicles deep, and men stepping out of them in dark suits with earpieces and rigid postures. Dean counted them from the window. 12 men, all of them facing the house. He opened the front door. The lead driver met him at the top of the porch steps. He was broad-shouldered, professional, and spoke like a man who had rehearsed the sentence. "We're with Lattimore Maritime Corporate Security. We're here for Ms. Lattimore." Dean's hand stopped on the doorframe. Lattimore. The name landed somewhere behind his ribs, in a place he had sealed off 3 years ago and had not opened since. Lattimore Maritime. Norfolk, Virginia. Building 7, Advanced Hull Systems Division. 9 years of his life reduced to a filing cabinet in the back of his shop and a photograph on the wall he never explained. The woman stepped past him onto the porch. Her posture changed in a way that was difficult to describe but impossible to miss. Shoulders leveled. Chin came up, every motion precise. She told the lead driver to hold position. She told the remaining team to stay with the vehicles. She did not raise her voice, but every man in the driveway stopped moving. "I'm Paige Lattimore," she said to the driver. "I'll be ready when I'm ready." Dean stayed in the doorway. He watched the way the driver responded to her. The immediate compliance, the half-step backward, the way his hand dropped from his earpiece. This was not a courtesy. This was chain of command. The woman who had slept on his couch, who had walked a mile down a dark road with a flat tire and knocked on a stranger's door, was the chief executive of a $2 billion defense shipbuilder. She turned back to Dean. "I'm sorry about all this." Dean looked at her, then at the SUVs, then at the Lattimore Maritime crest on the lead vehicle's door panel, a blue anchor over crossed hull frames, the same crest that had been printed on his employee badge for 9 years. The woman standing in front of him was the daughter of Graham Lattimore, the man who had signed Dean's first contract, the man who had shaken his hand in a conference room in Norfolk in 2012 and told him, "Build me something the Navy has never seen." And Dean had. She did not know that. She had no reason to. "Your car," Dean said, after a beat. "I'll still check it." They took his truck. The security detail followed at a distance. 3 SUVs, 60 yards back, moving at whatever speed Dean set. He did not acknowledge them. Paige sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap. Neither of them spoke. The car was where she said it would be. A silver sedan pulled onto the shoulder of a 2-lane road, about a mile north of Dean's property, half hidden by Spanish moss hanging from a live oak. The morning light filtered through the canopy and fell in pale stripes across the hood. Dean walked around the vehicle once before crouching at the right rear tire. It was flat, but it had not blown. He ran his thumb along the valve stem. Clean cut, straight through. No tearing, no fatigue marks. Someone had taken a blade to it. He stood up and looked at Paige. She was already looking at the tire. Her jaw was set. She had suspected this. Seeing it confirmed was something different. "That's not road damage," Dean said. "No," she said. "It's not." He did not ask who. She did not offer. He hooked the sedan to his hitch and towed it back to the shop. At the shop, Paige made a phone call from the parking lot. She spoke in short, controlled sentences, told someone at Lattimore she would be late, gave no reason, ended the call. Dean changed the tire, checked the brakes and the undercarriage, and found nothing else wrong. The valve stem was the only point of sabotage. One cut, precise, deliberate, enough to strand her on a rural road after dark. Not enough to cause a wreck at speed. He worked in silence. Paige stood near the bay door and watched. She had been around engineers and mechanics her entire life, and something about the way Dean moved did not match the shop. His hands were calloused, his shirt was stained with epoxy, but the way he examined the brake line, tracing it with 2 fingers, checking the fittings by feel, pausing at each junction point, was diagnostic. systematic, like a man reading a blueprint through his fingertips. She noticed a framed photograph on the wall behind the lathe. A younger Dean, standing on the deck of a large vessel, wearing a hard hat and a safety harness, with open ocean behind him. She looked at it for a long time, but did not ask. The front door of the shop opened. Ben came in, backpack over one shoulder, dropped off by Fran. He saw Paige, paused for a moment, then offered a quiet hello. She returned it. He walked to his workbench, sat down, and opened his pencil case. Paige watched him, the careful way he laid out his tools in a row before touching the model, and then turned back to the bay door. Dean caught the look. He said nothing. The company Paige Lattimore ran was not small. Lattimore Maritime was a $2.1 billion defense shipbuilder headquartered on Hutchinson Island in Savannah, Georgia. They built patrol vessels, littoral combat ships, and specialized naval craft under contract with the United States Navy. The company employed 3,800 people across 2 shipyards and a design center, and it had been in operation for 31 years. Paige's father, Graham Lattimore, had founded the company in 1993. He built it from a single dry dock and a Navy surplus contract into one of the most respected mid-tier defense firms on the East Coast. He died in 23, a stroke, at his desk on a Thursday afternoon. Paige was 33. She had been working at the company for 4 years, first in operations, then as vice president of strategic programs. The board appointed her CEO within the month. She had held the position for 2 years, long enough to understand the company, not long enough, in the eyes of certain board members, to have earned the chair on anything other than her last name. The man most people assumed should have gotten the job was Vince Drayton, Chief Operating Officer, 20 years at Lattimore. He had started in procurement, moved into program management, and worked his way up through every division in the company before Graham made him COO in 2014. He knew the contracts. He knew the shipyard supervisors by shift and by name. He knew the Navy liaison officers by their drink orders. When Graham died, half the board expected Vince to step into the role. He did not. He stayed COO. He said the right things. He supported Paige publicly. And he waited. The night before she showed up at Dean's door, Paige had been at the Hutchinson Island shipyard until past 10. She had gone alone, after hours, to review a set of maintenance contract records for the Garrison-class fleet, 14 vessels built under a 2016 Navy contract that remained Lattimore's most profitable program. The numbers were wrong. Not dramatically, not in a way that would jump off a summary page, but in the structural details. The billing for hull refurbishment work was running $4,200 per vessel higher than the original design specs should have required. Spread across 14 ships and 3 years of annual maintenance cycles, the overage was significant, and it traced back to the engineering baseline itself. She left the shipyard at 10:30, driving her own car, taking the back roads to avoid the main highway. She did not tell anyone where she had been. Somewhere on a 2-lane road east of the Wilmington River, her tire went flat. Now, standing in Dean's boat shop, watching a man she did not know replace the valve stem on her car, Paige told him, in general terms, that she had found inconsistencies in a set of engineering contracts, that the structural specifications in her company's records did not match the original design intent, that someone may have altered the foundation. Dean was under the car when she said it. His hand stopped moving. He slid out from beneath the chassis and sat up on the creeper, wiping his palms on a rag, and looked at her. Garrison-class? He said. Paige went still. How do you know that name? Dean folded the rag once, then again. He set it on the edge of the creeper. Lucky guess, he said. It was not a guess, and both of them knew it. He did not say anything more. Not then. But that night, after Ben was asleep and the shop was dark and the security detail had finally pulled off the road and dispersed, Dean sat at the workbench in the back of the shop with the overhead fluorescent buzzing above him and pulled open the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet he had not touched in 3 years. The drawer was full. Binders, specification sheets, structural calculation packages, load analysis reports. Every document organized by system, by vessel class, by revision date. Not copies from the Lattimore server. His own work. His originals. The ones he had written by hand before they were ever entered into the company's digital system. He had kept them because they were his, not proprietary data, but the thinking behind it. The math. The margins. The late-night calculations done in pencil on graph paper while Elise slept in the next room. Dean Halford had spent 9 years as a senior naval architect at Lattimore Maritime, from 2012 to 21. He worked out of the Norfolk office, in the Advanced Hull Systems Division, and he was the lead designer on the Garrison-class reinforcement program, the project that had won the company its largest Navy contract in history. The system he designed used a titanium alloy grade 23 laminate bonded to the interior hull plating at calculated stress points. It extended the structural service life of each vessel to 30 years, twice the industry standard, and reduced life cycle maintenance costs by $140 million across the fleet. The Navy had never seen numbers like that from a mid-tier contractor. It was the reason Lattimore went from a regional shipbuilder to a nationally competitive defense firm. And it was Dean's work. Every calculation, every stress model, every line. He never talked about it. Not because it was classified, the broad strokes were public, but because the person who had designed it no longer existed. That version of Dean had a wife who brought him coffee at his drafting table at midnight, and a house in Norfolk with a workshop in the garage, and a life that made sense. When Elise died, the work stopped meaning what it used to mean. He submitted his resignation in December of 21, effective immediately. No exit interview. No transition plan. Just a letter and a forwarding address that no one ever used. He moved to Savannah because it was warm and close to the water and far enough from Norfolk that the street names would not remind him of anything. He did not know Lattimore Maritime was headquartered here. By the time he found out, he did not care enough to leave. Now he sat in his shop at 11 at night, with the Garrison-class binder open on the workbench. The original specs were in his handwriting. Titanium alloy laminate. Grade 23. 30-year rated service life. 0 scheduled hull replacements. Page had said the current specs in Lattimore's records called for a 15-year service life and standard marine steel. Someone had changed the foundation of his design, and they had used the change to justify billing the Navy for work that the ships did not need. Dean closed the binder. He did not show it to Page. Not yet. He needed to understand the full shape of what had happened before he stepped back into a world he had walked away from. Fran Colby came by that evening with a casserole dish and a bag of groceries for Ben. She set them on the counter without ceremony, glanced through the kitchen window at the silver sedan still parked in the shop lot, and looked at Dean. "You've got company," she said. "Temporary," Dean said. Fran studied him, the way she did when she knew he was carrying something he had not put down yet, and then nodded once and left without pressing it. The next night, Dean laid both sets of specifications side by side on the workbench. On the left, his originals. Handwritten calculations, structural diagrams, alloy compositions, fatigue cycle projections. Every page dated and initialed. Titanium alloy grade 23 laminate. 30-year rated hull life. 0 scheduled replacement intervals. On the right, the current Lattimore records. Page had given him access to the digital maintenance files, not because she knew his background, but because she trusted his mechanical judgment and wanted a second pair of eyes on numbers she could not explain. She sat across the bench from him, reviewing billing summaries on her laptop, while Dean compared the engineering data line by line. The differences were not subtle. They were foundational. The alloy grade had been downgraded from titanium to standard marine steel in the archived specs. The rated hull life had been cut in half, from 30 years to 15, and the maintenance schedule had been expanded to include full hull replacements at year 8, 12, and 15, replacements that the original design rendered completely unnecessary. Every one of those replacements generated a billing event. $4,200 per vessel per cycle. 14 vessels. 3 maintenance cycles per year. Over 3 years, the total came to $58.8 million in work the Navy was paying for that did not need to be done. Dean traced the revision history in the digital files. The specifications had been updated in March of 22, 6 months after he left the company. The revision memo was attached, a 1-page internal directive citing updated Navy structural requirements and authorizing the downgrade in alloy grade and service life ratings. The memo was signed by Vincent Drayton, Chief Operating Officer. Dean pulled up the Navy's published structural requirements for the Garrison class. They had not changed since 2016. There were no updated requirements. The memo cited a document that did not exist. He sat back and looked at the 2 sets of specifications, his originals, and the current Lattimore archive, and understood the full architecture of what had been done. The gap between them was not an error. It was not a miscommunication or a filing mistake or an engineer's shortcut taken under deadline pressure. It was designed. Someone had rebuilt the mathematical foundation of his work, the alloy grades, the fatigue models, the service life projections, to create a billing structure that could run for years without setting off a single audit flag. And they had done it within 6 months of his departure, while his name was still on the original files, and no one at the company knew where he had gone or whether he would ever look back. Paige had stopped typing. She was watching him. She had seen the shift, the way his hands had gone still on the pages, the way his breathing had changed, the way he was looking at the numbers not as a consultant checking someone else's math, but as a man recognizing his own handwriting in a document that someone had rewritten without his knowledge or consent. Dean reached under the bench and pulled out his binder. He opened it to the first page, the original hull reinforcement calculations, dated August 2015, with his initials in the corner, and placed it in front of her. "I wrote these," he said. "I was the lead naval architect on the Garrison program. I worked at Lattimore for 9 years, out of the Norfolk office. The hull reinforcement system in these ships, the one your company bills the Navy to maintain, I designed it." The shop was quiet. The fluorescent light hummed above them. The river was dark through the bay door. Paige looked down at the binder, at the handwriting, at the date. Then she looked at Dean. "I didn't know you were his daughter," Dean said. "I didn't know you were the one who built it," Paige said. Her hand rested flat on the workbench, an inch from the edge of the binder. Neither of them moved for a long time. The only sound was the river and the low electrical buzz of the overhead light. Somewhere in the filing cabinet behind Dean was every piece of evidence needed to prove that the current Garrison specs were forged and that $58.8 million in Navy contracts had been billed against a lie signed by the man who sat 4 doors from her office. Paige took Dean's binder to Lattimore's legal department the following morning. The in-house counsel brought in a forensic document examiner and a digital systems analyst. The comparison took 2 days. Dean's original specifications, handwritten, dated, initialed, predated every digital revision in the Lattimore archive by 7 years. The alloy grades, service life ratings, and fatigue cycle calculations in his binder matched the Navy's original contract terms exactly. The current digital specs did not. The revision memo signed by Vince Drayton cited updated Navy structural requirements. The legal team submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to Naval Sea Systems Command. The response came back in 4 business days. No such requirements had been issued. The document Vince cited did not exist in any Navy database, archive, or correspondence log. Paige authorized a full forensic audit of the Garrison maintenance contracts. She brought in an outside accounting firm, not Lattimore's regular auditors, who had missed the discrepancy for 3 years, but a forensic team out of Atlanta with federal contract experience. Within the first week, they found a second layer beneath the specification fraud. The hull replacement work that had been billed to the Navy, $58.8 million over 3 years, had not been performed by Lattimore's own shipyard crews. It had been subcontracted. Every single invoice for the hull replacement work traced back to a single entity, Drayton Marine Consulting, registered in Chatham County, Georgia. The invoices were formatted to look like standard subcontractor billings, complete with work orders, material receipts, and inspection sign-offs. But when the auditors cross-referenced the work orders against the shipyard's own dock logs and crane schedules, the dates did not match. On 4 of the invoice dates, the vessels in question had not been in dry dock at all. Fran Colby found the corporate filing. She had spent 31 years as a clerk in the Chatham County Recorder's office before she retired, and when Dean mentioned the company name over coffee one morning at his kitchen table, she did not need to be asked twice. She went home, sat down at her computer, and pulled up the public business registration in under 10 minutes. Drayton Marine Consulting had been incorporated in March of 22, the same month the Garrison specifications were revised. The registered agent was Vince Drayton's wife. The business address was a commercial mail drop on Abercorn Street downtown. There were no employees on file, no office lease, no equipment inventory, nothing but a name and a bank account. Vince learned about the audit on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, he had contacted 4 members of the Lattimore Board of Directors. His narrative was constructed with the precision of a man who had been preparing for this conversation longer than anyone realized. Paige was inexperienced, he told them. She had brought in a former employee, a man who had left the company under vague circumstances 3 years ago, and given him access to proprietary engineering files. She was making decisions based on the claims of a disgruntled outsider. The audit was unauthorized. The legal costs were mounting. The board needed to act. 3 board members requested a formal explanation from Paige. Vince filed a motion for an emergency review of the CEO's leadership decisions. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. The evidence was building, but Vince was not defending himself against the evidence. He was attacking the people who had found it. The boardroom at Lattimore Maritime's Hutchinson Island headquarters seated 14. On Thursday morning, 12 chairs were filled. Paige sat at the head of the table. Vince sat 4 seats down on the left side, his posture relaxed, his hands folded on the table. His attorney was in the chair behind him. Vince spoke first. He had prepared a 6-page memorandum outlining what he called a pattern of erratic decision-making by the CEO. He cited her engagement of Dean Halford, described as a former employee with no current affiliation, as an unauthorized consultant. He cited the forensic audit as a misallocation of legal resources without board approval. He did not mention Drayton Marine Consulting. He did not mention the $58.8 million. Paige let him finish. Then she opened a binder of her own. She presented Dean's original Garrison specs side by side with the current Lattimore archive. She presented the FOIA response from Naval Sea Systems Command confirming no updated requirements existed. She presented the Chatham County business filing for Drayton Marine Consulting, the incorporation date, the registered agent, the mail drop address. She laid each document flat on the table without commentary and let the board read. 2 of the 3 members who had aligned with Vince shifted in their seats. Then the general counsel stood and read aloud a letter that had arrived that morning from the office of the Navy Inspector General. A formal investigation had been opened into billing irregularities on the Garrison-class maintenance contracts. Full cooperation and document preservation were requested. The room changed. This was no longer a boardroom dispute about leadership style. This was federal exposure, defense contract fraud, wire fraud, false claims. Every board member understood what the letter meant for anyone whose name was attached to the billing. The motion to review Paige's leadership was withdrawn before it reached a vote. A second motion was introduced, immediate suspension of Vincent Drayton pending the investigation. The vote was 8-2. Vince stood. He did not look at Paige. He straightened his tie, picked up his briefcase, and walked out without a word. After the meeting, Paige stayed in the boardroom alone, both palms flat on the table. Dean was in the parking lot, leaning against the tailgate of his truck, looking at the river through the chain-link fence. He had driven her that morning. He had not gone inside. Paige came through the glass doors and stopped at the top of the steps. She saw him across the lot. She walked down and stopped a few feet away. Neither of them said anything. After a moment, she leaned against the tailgate next to him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and they stood like that while the afternoon light moved across the water. The weeks that followed were procedural. The FBI's Savannah Field office opened a formal investigation into Drayton Marine Consulting. Federal agents served subpoenas on the company's bank records, tax filings, and contract documentation. The trail was clean and direct. Every dollar billed through the shell company traced back to maintenance work that had either been performed at a fraction of the invoiced cost or had not been performed at all. The total overage across 3 years matched the forensic audit's projection within 2%. Vince Drayton was indicted on 7 counts: defense contract fraud, wire fraud, and false claims under the False Claims Act. He did not contest the charges publicly. His attorney released a 2-sentence statement and requested a continuance. The case was assigned to the Southern District of Georgia. Lattimore Maritime cooperated fully with the investigation. Paige retained outside counsel to manage the company's legal exposure and worked directly with the Navy's program office to restructure the Garrison maintenance contracts based on Dean's original design specifications. The process was not fast. It was conference calls and document reviews and revised billing schedules that stretched across weeks. But the company held. Dean went back to his shop. He drove home the afternoon of the indictment, parked his truck in the gravel lot, and walked into the shop like it was any other Wednesday. He pulled the tarp off a 19-foot bowrider that needed new stringers, set up his saw, and started cutting fiberglass. By the time Ben came home from school, Dean was covered in dust, and the radio was playing low, and the shop smelled like resin and sawdust. The way it always smelled when he was working, the way it had smelled every day for 3 years before any of this started. He did not attend the indictment hearing. He did not speak to the reporters who called the shop twice and got the answering machine both times. He did not submit a consulting invoice or ask to be credited in any court filing or government document. Page's legal team contacted him once, by letter, to confirm his willingness to provide testimony if the case went to trial. He signed the acknowledgement at the kitchen table that evening, put it in an envelope, and mailed it back the next morning on his way to the hardware store. 2 weeks later, Page drove out to the shop on a Saturday morning. Not in a company vehicle. In her own car, a blue sedan she had bought to replace the silver one, which she told Dean she could not look at anymore without thinking about the valve stem. She parked in the gravel lot and walked through the bay door carrying a folder under her arm. It was a contract offer, a consulting naval architect position with Lattimore Maritime, reporting directly to the CEO's office. Competitive salary, full benefits, a dedicated workspace at the design center on Hutchinson Island. Dean read it standing at the workbench. He turned each page slowly. Then he set the folder down and looked at her. "I appreciate it," he said, "but I'm good here." Page nodded. She did not argue it. She did not pitch it again. She picked up the folder and slid it back under her arm. Ben was at his workbench in the back corner, fitting a small rudder onto his model trawler with a pair of needle-nose pliers. He looked up when he heard Page's footsteps and waved her over. She walked to his bench and sat down on the stool next to him. He showed her how the rudder pivoted on a pin he had cut from a paperclip. She leaned in close, watched the mechanism, and when he handed her a piece of fine grit sandpaper and pointed to a rough spot on the hull, she took it without hesitating. Dean stood on the other side of the shop, a wrench in one hand, watching the two of them bent over the workbench. He did not say anything. He did not need to. 3 months later, the light on the Wilmington River turned the color of brass. It was late October, and the air had cooled enough to leave the shop bay doors open without the humidity pressing in. Dean had finished a hull repair that morning, a 16-foot John boat with rotted transom planking, and was cleaning his tools when he heard the gravel shift outside. Page's car was in the lot. She had been coming by. Not every day, not on a schedule, but often enough that the space next to Dean's truck had started to feel like it belonged to someone. Sometimes she brought lunch from the deli on Skidaway Road. Sometimes she sat at the workbench with her laptop and worked while Dean worked, the two of them in the same room without needing to fill it with conversation. Sometimes she brought nothing at all and just stood at the bay door with a cup of coffee from his pot, watching the river, and Dean would look up from whatever he was doing and find her there, and neither of them would say anything, and that was enough. Today she came inside and set a folder on the bench. It was thinner than the contract offer she had brought months ago. Dean looked at it, but did not open it. "The Navy renewed the contract," she said. "Full fleet, 20-year extension. Based on your original specs, titanium alloy laminate, 30-year service life, 0 scheduled hull replacements. Everything you designed." The program office reviewed the specs line by line, and they renewed without negotiation. They said the design was the strongest structural baseline they had seen from any contractor in 20 years. Dean nodded slowly. He picked up a clamp from the bench and turned it in his hands. He had expected the renewal. The design was sound. It had always been sound. That was never the part that had been in question. "Your name is going back on the design files," she said. "Every revision, every calculation, every stress model. The legal team finished the restoration last week. It's yours again." Dean picked up a rag from the workbench and wiped his hands. He folded it once, then again, and set it down. "I didn't stay for the name," he said. Page looked at him. She did not ask what he stayed for. She did not need to. The answer was in the shop around them, the tools on their pegs, the hull on the stands, the smell of epoxy and river water, and the boy at the workbench in the back corner who had started building a new model without telling anyone. This one was smaller than the others. A miniature of a Garrison-class hull, proportioned from memory, with tiny reinforcement plates glued along the keel line in precise intervals. Dean had found it one morning on the bench, half finished, with a pencil sketch of the hull cross-section taped to the wall behind it. He had stood there for a long time, his hand on the edge of the bench, before walking away and letting it be. The sun dropped lower. The light came through the bay door and stretched long and warm across the concrete floor. Dean walked out to the dock and stood at the railing with both hands on the wood, looking out at the water. The river was calm. A shrimp boat was heading in from Wassaw Sound, its outriggers raised, riding low with the day's catch. Paige followed him out. She stood at the railing a few inches from his arm. The evening was quiet. No engines. No gravel. No convoy on the road. Just the water and the sound of the shrimp boat's diesel idling down as it turned toward the dock upriver. His hand moved along the railing until it found hers. She did not pull away. She turned her palm upward, and his fingers settled into it. And they stood like that while the shrimp boat came in and the light on the river turned from brass to amber to something deeper that did not have a name. Inside the shop, Ben looked up from his model. He saw them through the window. Two figures on the dock, close together, still. He watched for a moment. Then he turned back to his work, picked up the sandpaper, and smoothed the edge of a hull that had been built to last. He hadn't asked. That was the reason she stayed.